Well, I certainly appreciate everybody coming out in the pouring rain here. At least it's not as bad as it was last night when I came home. Tried to go home to about 2.5 hours to get into Northern Virginia in the height of the cloudburst. So I don't know whether this is biblical or climate change or whatever's going on here, but it's been raining for an awful long time in Washington. My name is Ray Kopp, and I'm a senior fellow, and I direct the Center for Climate and Electricity Policy at Resources for the Future. And for those of you that, there's a lot of faces I recognize in the audience and some that I don't, but for those of you who know Resources for the Future, know for the most part that we're a research organization that works from a paradigm of economics for the most part. And if you normally come to events at RFF, you expect to see some equations and a couple of graphs and a heavy dose of economics. However, we do consider ourselves to be social scientists. And in a lot of the work that we do, we weave social science into many of our research projects. Today, you're not going to see something from the paradigm of economics. You're going to look at climate change through a different lens, and I think you're going to find this particularly interesting. It's a lens of political psychology and survey research. And so this is a different sort of event than RFF normally would provide, but one that I think you're going to find particularly interesting, and I know I do. And it's my pleasure to introduce the speaker, which is a great pleasure because the speaker, John, is a long-term friend of mine. I think about 20 years now that we have been have had a friendship and have been colleagues, working in research activities of a variety of different shapes and forms. And it's I think it's fair to say that I probably wouldn't admit this to a lot of folks, but I'll admit it now, that John has kind of fundamentally changed the way I think about human behavior and attitudes. And for an economist to admit that some other social scientist can have any influence over how they think about these things is a tribute to John's intellectual prowess.
Just a quick question, Ray. Is there going to be a document that we can get our hands on after this, or do we have to take notes?
You have to take notes. We'll find something. And so, yeah, not only has John changed my attitudes, but a lot of the economists that he has worked with, and he has worked with quite a few, have also changed attitudes. So maybe we'll have some attitudes changed as we go through to this today. So it is a great pleasure to introduce John, who is a long-term friend and colleague. Importantly, John is a RFF University Fellow and has been associated with us for quite some time. As many of you may know, and probably most of you don't know, an accomplished jazz drummer, and the Frederick O. Glover Professor of Humanities and Social Sciences at Stanford University. John, I'll turn it over to you.
Ray, thank you very much. The volume is going to be okay for people, I hope. If we do it like this, good. Ray, thank you for that wonderful introduction. It is 20 years of friendship that we have, and it is a great honor for me to be here at Resources for the Future today, and to have this relationship as a university fellow here. So I appreciate that very much, and I appreciate your coming out today. Thank you so much for coming to have a free lunch. And my understanding is that all the people who are watching on the webcast, their free lunch is already in the mail. But the postage is not too significant because I've been told that there is no such thing as a free lunch. But regardless of that, the beginning of this discussion today for me is to thank two people, Bo McInnes and Anna Villar, who have done tremendous work over the last few years on the work that I will talk about today. I also want to thank Resources for the Future for making this work possible. In our most recent collaboration, we've worked with Reuters and Ipsos and Mass Inc. polling. You'll hear some brand new results today, and you will hear work that's been supported by the National Science Foundation, to whom we are also grateful. But the full list of our collaborators over the years in this program of research that dates back 15 years is important to note. Ray didn't mention my PhD is in social psychology, and at Stanford I'm a professor of communication, political science, and psychology. And in that role, I do two things. One, I try to understand how Americans think about and act in the domain of politics. I want to understand what causes some people to vote and others not, what leads people to choose a particular candidate, how people form their preferences on particular issues, and climate change is only one of the issues that we've looked at over time. The second element of my research is, as Ray said, in survey methodology. I study politics through surveys, and a good chunk of my research explores how to do surveys well to get the most accurate measurements. And so bringing those lines of work together leads to what you'll see today. In this work, my goal is not to advocate any particular point of view, but rather to document and understand what the public thinks. And in doing this work, I express conclusions that exist in a space with other speculations. And I want to just begin with a few quotes from people who have publicly speculated about what the public thinks on this issue. Here's one by John Sterman in Science, obviously a highly prestigious publication. He said, "The strong scientific consensus on the causes and risks of climate change stands in stark contrast to widespread confusion and complacency among the public." In October 2009, you may remember seeing headlines across the country reporting the results of a single poll, in some cases talking about beliefs in the existence of global warming. For example, fewer Americans believe in global warming. Others, based on the same poll, talking about certainty. Americans more confused about climate, for example. Still other headlines talking about concern about climate change waning. Or my favorite headlines, the cute ones, for example, U.S. belief in global warming is cooling. In December 2010, a year later, said Bloomberg Businessweek, "The number of Americans who agree the Earth is warming because of man-made activity has been in free fall." That's a dramatic statement. And February 2011, The Economist asked, "Why don't Americans believe in global warming?" So the good news is people care about what the public thinks. And I think for many of us looking at American democracy, we would like that to be at least part of the input to government decision-making. So the question then is, what does the public really believe? Are these quotes really accurately characterizing what the American public thinks and wants? So I will tell you about evidence based on a series of national surveys that we've been doing. We started in 1997, and the most recent one was done just a few weeks ago with Ipsos and Reuters. We've always looked at representative scientific probability samples of American adults. They're interviewed by telephone, calling landlines and cell phones. We do extensive interviewer training and supervision. I lose sleep at night designing questions to be sure that they're balanced and unbiased. And we never introduced the surveys as being about global warming. You could imagine beginning a phone call by saying, "We're calling to talk to you about this topic." People uninterested or skeptical would hang up. So we begin by saying, "We're calling to talk to you about important issues facing the country," and therefore avoid that bias. Today, I'll take you through a small set of the research that we've been doing, including the most recent work. In part one, we'll talk about American public opinion on climate change between 1997, when we did our first study collaborating with Resources for the Future and the National Science Foundation, and up to our most recent one with Ipsos and Reuters. We will look, importantly, in part two, at regional differences across the country. Is it the case that people in different states differ in their views on this issue in ways that would have important implications, let's say, for votes cast in Congress? And lastly, the major focus of today is the brand new work that we've done, looking at whether climate change influences voting. And we'll focus in particular on the 2008 and 2010 elections by asking the question, does it matter what a candidate said on this issue in influencing how many votes he or she got? Okay, part one. Let me show you a few quick slides to give you a sense of what has happened on public opinion in this issue. This first slide begins in 1997 and goes through November 2010, the most recent time when we asked this question. We asked Americans how much they feel they know about the issue of climate change, and you can see a steady growth over this time period of the percent of people putting themselves at the top 2 points on our rating scale, that they know a lot or a moderate amount. Now, you might wonder whether it matters whether people think they know much on an issue. Is it possible that there are people who think they know a lot who don't, and people who are very humble and yet know quite a bit? As it turns out, this kind of change over time correlates remarkably well with people's performance on quizzes. So if you actually ask them factual quiz questions, the people who say they know more do better on these quizzes. There's good correspondence. So this is, I think, not surprising. There has been a growth of media attention to the issue over this time period. Americans pay attention to it, and they feel more confident in their views. here's a key question for us in our surveys to tap whether people believe this phenomena even exists. So we've asked people, you may have heard about the idea that the world's temperature may have been going up slowly over the past 100 years. What's your personal opinion on this? Do you think this has probably been happening, or do you think it probably has not been happening? So that gives you an example of a balanced question that expresses an idea in a particular way. You could imagine asking it differently, but let me show you what the results have looked like up until 2010. So I'm going to hold for a moment showing you the latest 2011 results until after I give you the background. So as you can see over this time period, in 1997, when we started doing this work, fully 79% of Americans said they thought that the planet had been gradually heating up. That number a year ago was 75%, not significantly different from that 79%. So anybody who tells you that this number is in free fall, or why do Americans not believe in global warming, this result does not comport with those statements. Now, there is, in fact, a statistically significant drop from this 85% to this 75%. But I think the important takeaway here is not, oh, things have been going down. But if you look in recent years, things have been holding steady. And in fact, as you'll see, this story becomes even more interesting in a moment when we look at the 2011 data. We also ask people how sure they are of their opinions about the existence of climate change. And among the people who said climate change has been happening, the percent placing themselves at the top 2 points on this rating scale was 44% in 1997, 45% a year ago. Again, a little bit of an increase here a few years ago, but no significant drop over this full time period. When you look at the question about causes, we ask people, if the Earth's temperature has been heating up gradually over the last 100 years, do you think it's mostly caused by things people have done, mostly caused by natural processes, or caused about equally by things people have done in natural processes? Fully 80% in 2006 said they thought it was due to human action. That number is not significantly different now at 75%. So again, no dramatic drop. The last of these, almost, we asked people, do you think if the Earth's temperature were to increase by 5 degrees Fahrenheit on average 75 years from now, would this be good, bad, or neither good nor bad? 60% of Americans in 1997 said they thought it would be bad. That number was 56% a year ago. Again, not a statistically significant change. Now, this is a point where you could imagine some natural scientists saying, what? Clearly, that kind of increase would be very bad. But it's a question of predicting the future, right? How will we adapt? And certainly some of the people who say it will be good may be thinking about the possibility that this is the wake-up call that's needed in order to inspire the economy to shift into greener ways of generating energy. So there are any number of reasons why people might see this as a good thing. Here's the last of these. We asked people, do you think the federal government should be doing more, less, or about what it is now on the issue of climate change? In 1997, a little less than half of Americans said they thought the federal government should be doing more. That number jumped up to nearly 70% in the mid-2000s at the end of the George W. Bush administration. After Barack Obama was elected, that number dropped to about 60%, where it has been holding steady since then. This is a message from Americans that, in general, they want to see more done. I'm not going to take time today to repeat some material I've presented in other talks here in Washington about specific policies, but I invite you to visit the website at the Woods Institute for the Environment at Stanford that presents our reports, where you can see much larger numbers than this of Americans who support specific policies to reduce future emissions. Now, here's a very interesting finding. When you compare people's judgments, first of all, about how much do you think the federal government should do on this issue, 59% of people in November 2010 placed themselves at one of the top 2 points, a great deal or quite a bit. We then asked people, how much do you think the federal government is doing on this issue? And only 16% of people said the federal government is doing as much as they would like. So there's a big gap between the amount of effort people would like government to be implementing and the amount of effort they think is being implemented at the moment. Now, when I presented results like this about a year and a half ago in conversations with senators, congressional representatives, their staffs, and their committees, they said to me, thank you very much. These national surveys are very nice and entertaining. But we think the people in our state or district are different from the country as a whole because we're getting very different messages. So I thought, wow. So here I and my colleagues have been doing national surveys in order to help government understand their constituents. And yet, quite understandably, these representatives say, I need to know about my constituents, not the country as a whole. So what we did was to go back to our shop and to build what we call a concatenated data set, where we took every survey that we had done, stacked them all together, and then broke them out by state, so that we would have enough people in each state to actually make statements about the percent of them who are, you might say, on the green side of this issue or not. So I want to walk you through some of these results to see whether, in fact, there are some pockets of the country where there is much more skepticism about climate change. You could certainly imagine developing hypotheses about this. You might say, for example, people in Florida and Texas who are boiling already during the summer would be very unhappy about boiling more. You could imagine people in colder temperatures actually being more sensitive to changes in temperature recently, maybe. You could imagine people in states where the economy hinges more on oil or natural gas might be more skeptical about government efforts in those domains. But it turns out none of those hypotheses are going to help you very much because these are the results we find. Let's talk first of all about this question on whether climate change has been happening. In no state, could we find a majority of the residents on the skeptical side of the issue. The smallest majority we saw on the green side was 66%, and the largest majority we saw was 99%. And let me show you a map so that you can get a feel for this variation. So first of all, apologies to North Dakota. There is not an X there because we don't like them. We did not have enough survey respondents there to actually produce a reliable estimate. So let's leave them out. Across the rest of the country, this 66% is in Nevada. That's the lowest number. And the darker the state, the more green they are, you might say. Maybe we should have made them green, actually. And so the darker the state, the larger the majority on the green side of the issue. So you can see Kansas is on the lighter side. Look at some dark states here. Oklahoma. Interesting. Okay. Let's look at another one. Is human activity causing warming that may have been happening? The smallest majority that we saw was 64%. No, never did we find a state that had a majority on the skeptical side of the issue. Again, the largest majority at 99%. The next question, should government do more? We actually did find one state where a majority of Americans said, no, I don't want government doing more. But the majorities ranged up to 92%. Let me show you. Idaho is the state where only 43% favored more government action. The next largest was 54% in Missouri, 65% in Texas, and increased from there on up. So the really dark states are where huge majorities are saying government should do more. Sorry?
Where's Alaska?
Not in the picture, is it? Guess why? Not enough respondents. We could put an X on Alaska. Let me just take a moment to look at states that have high employment in the coal and oil industries. So I'm circling them here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Okay? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. You might imagine those would all be light. They would all be on the skeptical side of the issue. If there's powerful impact of that economic consideration, they're not. Okay. One more. Should government limit greenhouse gas emissions by businesses? The smallest majority on the green side, 65%. The largest majority, 96%. And so these numbers, 65 up in Maine, 66 in Arkansas, 69 in Utah. Lots of support for limiting emissions in various states. Okay, so that's the portrait of where we came to as of the end of 2010. Now let's go to part 2. What happened in 2011? And I can show you 2 sets of results, beginning with brand new results. No one has seen these yet. They're being released today for the first time. This is a collaboration between Stanford and Mass Inc. polling group. We were delighted to collaborate in this process because we had done our own survey in Massachusetts about a year ago, and we worked with them to repeat some of those questions. And let me show you the results. So a year ago, in 2010, 84% of Massachusetts residents said they thought climate change had been happening. A year later, that number is 82%. Huge numbers, no significant change over this time period. When we looked at certainty, the people who were putting themselves at the top 2 points on the certainty scale, we actually do see a significant increase from 50% up to 63% in 1 year. So during that time period, there has been an increase in confidence in Massachusetts on that point of view. Among the people who are skeptical, among the people who say they think actually the Earth has not been warming gradually, their level of confidence has not changed. Only 35% of them were at the top 2 points of the certainty scale, and that remained exactly the same a year later. When we asked about how serious of a problem do you think climate change will be for the U.S., 82% of people put themselves at the top 2 points in 2010. That number is actually significantly, but slightly less, at 76% now. When we asked about seriousness for the world, however, how serious of a problem do you think this will be for the world if nothing is done to address it? 85% of people put themselves at the top 2 points of seriousness. In 2010, that number is essentially the same today. I'm going to skip that, and then I'll tell you more of a story later. Okay, so that's Massachusetts. Fine. Looks like some actual steadiness and a bit of upturn in confidence. What happened in the country as a whole? Well, thanks to our collaboration with Reuters and Ipsos, I can show you these new figures from just a few weeks ago. In 2010, I showed you that 75% of people in the country said they thought the planet had been heating up. That number has significantly increased over the last year, up to 83%. When we asked about certainty, how sure are you that the planet has been warming up? The top 2 point people, 48% of them placed themselves there at 2010. That number is 53% now, not significantly different. Here's the interesting news, though. Among the skeptics, among the people who say the planet has not been heating up, their certainty has actually increased quite notably during this last year, from 35% up to 53%, placing themselves at the top 2 points. And I would suggest to you that there are 2 explanations for this. One is this earlier result that I just showed you. So some of the uncertain people actually switched sides on this issue. They thought a year ago maybe the planet wasn't heating up, and today they've now shifted over to thinking it is heating up. But secondly, and I have no data to support this, as you know, the last 4-5 months have heard passionate statements from some candidates running for the Republican nomination expressing profound skepticism about climate change. Those statements are relatively new. We haven't heard that kind of attention to that kind of passionate statement in a while. And so the emergence of those views, I think, makes the skeptical citizens a little bit more encouraged and a little bit more reinforced in their own views. And I suspect that's contributing here as well. When we looked at, in the new Ipsos-Reuters data, did human activity play a role in causing warming? 75% of people a year ago, as I showed you earlier, said that was true. That number is not significantly different now. This is 72%. By the way, for anybody who is skeptical about survey research and says, you know, you do the same survey twice, you get completely different results. No, actually, you do the same survey twice, you get a lot of the same results over and over again. And I'm going to skip that as well. Okay, just one little footnote here before we go to the election data. This is a brand new poll that was just released on the European Union comparing 2010 to 2011. So if you're wondering, is it really true? Massachusetts seems to have become a little more green in the last year. The U.S. seems to have become a little more green in the last year. Is this real? Well, the Eurobarometer surveys have been going on for many years. This is a comparison of interviews done in August and September of 2009 versus June of 2011. 27 representative samples of 27 countries were interviewed, all face-to-face, sponsored by the European Commission, and the work was done by TNS Opinion and Social Research. Here's the question they asked: how serious a problem do you think climate change is at the moment? Please use a scale from 1 to 10, where 1 would mean that it is not at all a serious problem, and 10 would mean it is an extremely serious problem. And the percent of people placing themselves at the top of the scale, from 7 to 10, increased between 2009 and 2011 from 64% to 68%. That doesn't look like a big increase, but this is a gigantic number of interviews. It's more than 10,000 interviews. It's actually about 1,000 in each of 27 countries. So you have a lot of statistical power, and that difference is in fact statistically significant. So not only has Massachusetts and the U.S. shown an increase in greenness on this issue recently, but apparently much of Europe has as well. Which brings us to the centerpiece of today. This is the question of candidate choice. Fine, okay, people are green. They support policies. But are they actually willing to base votes in real elections on this issue? So to tell you the story, I need to begin with a little bit of a big picture on what political science knows about how voters make decisions. We've learned, for example, that there are two different cognitive processes by which voters can choose a candidate. One, psychologists call memory-based evaluation, involves the following. Election day, your spouse says to you, honey, don't forget, you got to vote this morning. Oh, yeah, okay. So that person goes to the polls and says, okay, who am I going to vote for? Now let me think back to the campaign and see what I can remember about each of the candidates. So you rely on what you can remember on election day. The alternative model, which appears to be much more common, is what psychologists call online evaluation, where throughout the course of the campaign, voters know election day is coming, they are thinking about the candidates and forming impressions of each of them. And they update those impressions every time they learn something new. So when they walk in the voting booth on election day, or even when they're asked in a survey 2 months before the election, how much weight are you going to put on climate change, or how much did you put on climate change when you made your decision? People can't actually answer that question because it's a process that has unfolded gradually over time. What they know is they like this guy and they don't like that guy, but they don't necessarily know why. So we've got to approach it in a different way. And the way we do it is through statistical analysis and through experimentation. And you'll see both types of methods used here today. I want to just show you a slightly, you might say, scary result that came from Alex Todorov, who's a professor at Princeton University, contributing importantly to this literature. What he showed is that if I were to show each of you 2 photographs, just the head and shoulders photograph of 2 candidates who competed with each other for a Senate seat 15 years ago, who you don't know, and I ask you to guess, who do you think won based on just the photograph? You would do significantly better than chance based on appearance alone. Now, it's not clear why that is. Is it the ratio of the distance between the eyes to the distance from the nose? Or is it just that the person who's doing better smiles more and wins because of that, or indicates that there are a lot of potential explanations. So understanding vote choice is a tricky business. But what we have learned over the years is that citizens send a signal to government on election days that is very foggy. And it's foggy because it's a combination of many different criteria that are put together. So if after the 2012 election you hear somebody say, the reason he won or the reason she won is this, it's not that. It's a conglomeration of many different factors. And we know that those factors include, first of all, there are a chunk of people who are very loyal to one of the political parties. They don't even know who the Republican nominee is yet, but they know they're going to vote for that person. There are, and that's true on the Democratic side as well, the performance of the incumbent is a very important determinant. If people feel the incumbent's been doing a good job, that party enjoys a greater likelihood of being elected. The health of the nation generally, if the country is in good shape and getting better, the parties in power are more likely to stay in. The interests of various social groups, as communicated through lobbying groups, for example, is an important component of people's decisions. Perceptions of the candidates' personalities, specifically the degree to which Americans think the candidates are intelligent, trustworthy, compassionate, influence their vote choices. The emotions evoked by the candidates. Does this candidate make me feel proud? Does this candidate make me feel afraid? Those factors add some explanatory power. So you'll notice in this list, I haven't mentioned policy issues at all. So now let's talk about policy. There have been 2 views in our literature about policy. One is that voting based on policy is rare in the American public. They're basically caught up in other things. And the reason, according to Phil Converse in 1964, is that people actually lack real preferences on policy issues. If you ask people, what do you want the government to do on issue X, he said, in the 1950s, most people had no idea. They'll give you an answer, but they don't mean it. They're actually flipping mental coins to answer that question. So, of course, they don't use that issue as a basis for vote choice. Furthermore, the candidates rarely staked out clear positions themselves. If you like to have some fun, read online transcripts of debates between presidential candidates in past years and look for some specific statement of, I will do this if I'm elected. They're hard to find. So maybe that impedes people's ability. And lastly, when candidates do take positions, they tend to do what political scientists say is hugging the middle. That is, they try to stay neutral or moderate rather than taking an extreme position. So you can imagine all this is true and that policies really don't matter. What you need to do is get out there and smile and scare people about the incumbent and so on. But there's a very different theory in our literature as well about what is called issue publics. And in fact, this also goes back to Phil Converse in his very important paper of 1964. He said, well, maybe not this, but maybe this instead. And it turns out he was right. For any given issue, there's a small group of citizens who are passionate about that issue. There is a group of Americans who wake up every morning saying, another day, another opportunity to influence gun control legislation, or capital punishment, or abortion. So is it true that maybe the same thing happens with regard to climate change? That's what we're going to look at. These issue public members on the lots of other issues that we've studied are people who pay very close attention to what the candidates say on an issue. So when the debate turns to gun control, people in the gun control issue public say, shh, I want to listen to this. Other people not in the gun control issue public say, I'm going to get a sandwich. So they actually don't hear what's said. But not only do the issue public members pay close attention, but they think carefully about it, and they even infer candidate differences when they're not stated explicitly. These folks can tell who the conservatives and liberals are on a particular policy dimension when they care about that dimension. And they vote based on this issue. So our question today is this. Is it the case that there is an issue public for climate change and that those people have actually been voting importantly based on this issue? Now, I'm not going to take time to show you this model. This is the focus of 25 years of research of my research team studying what leads people to care about an issue and what happens cognitively and behaviorally after it. But we're going to look at a series of predictions from this model based in the domain of climate change. So first of all, I want to show you that since 1997, when we measured it for the first time, the issue public for climate change has doubled from 8% up to almost 16%, 15% as of 2011. There was a little surge in the size of this group when the country was swimming in news coverage of it, and that number has essentially fallen back, held steady at about 15%.
Is that a positive issue public or positive and negative?
We'll get there.
All right, sorry.
So just to put this 15% in some perspective, I wanted to show you the sizes of some other issue publics that we've looked at over the years. So 15% might seem small to you, but in fact, it's typical. So race relations arouses passion from about 10% of Americans, women's rights 12%, capital punishment 14%, military spending 16%. The biggest issue public we've ever seen was for abortion in the mid-1990s at 31%. So this is pretty typical. And now to answer your question, actually let me put this in some perspective. When you look at all of these other issues, let's take gun control as an example. Look among the passionate Americans on that issue. They are split about equally, about 50-50 on what you might think of as the pro-gun control side and the anti-gun control side. And this poses a bit of a challenge for candidates. Because if you as a candidate say, okay, I'm going to come out on the pro-gun control side, those are the only people who are listening to you. You'll make about half of them happy and about half of them unhappy. The net gain is not much, typically. But climate change is different, really different. Let me show you this. So between 2006 and 2010, on the issues of the existence of climate change caused by human action, government should do more, look at these majorities. Gigantic majorities of the issue public are on what you might call the green side. Now, there are certainly people in this issue public who are skeptical about climate change, and they're audible at town hall meetings and visible in debate publicly. But they are vastly outnumbered by these folks who are on what you might call the green side of the issue and are passionate. So this sets us up to imagine that if a candidate were to take a green position on the issue, these people will be happy. And if a candidate does not take a green position or in fact expresses a skeptical position, these people will be unhappy and they will in fact be led perhaps not to vote for that person. So let's test those hypotheses and work through the data. So we'll look beginning at 2010 and the congressional elections. You might remember seeing these headlines speculating about this issue. One said, Democrats who took risk and voted for climate bill pay price. That was Politico. Cap and trade didn't kill the Democrats, said someone else. It's not the climate bill, stupid, said someone else. And ignoring evidence, Politico spins climate vote as electoral loser. So these are different folks looking at the same election outcomes, trying to make claims about what was driving those outcomes. So we did something they didn't do, because these were all issued within minutes of the election. We actually collected up the websites of all of the candidates running for seats in the House and Senate in 2010. So that's more than 900 websites. And we did what we call a content analysis of them. We had human coders read every website and answer a series of questions about what the website said, what did the candidate say, and categorized the candidate either as expressing a green position, expressing a not green position, or saying nothing about climate. There's a small group of people who expressed what we call a mixed view. They said some green and some not green things. Tiny group, we combined them with the nothing group in this analysis. So the question is there a relationship between what the candidates said and how they did in the election? Let's begin with what they said. First of all, among the Democrats running for seats in the Senate, 43% of them were silent, said nothing. 57% took a green position, and none of them took a not green position. So in some ways, you can think about this difference as being the focus of what we're going to talk about for the rest of our time together today. Were these people doing something smart or not? Okay. Among the Republicans running in the Senate, fully 83% said nothing on climate. Only 9% took a green position, and 9% took a not green position. Were these folks being smart? Were they, if they had taken a green position instead, would they have been wasting airtime on an issue that would not gain them votes, where they should have spent time talking about something else? What about the Democrats running in the House? 40% were silent on climate, 60% took a green position, and 1% took a not green position. So again, we can capitalize on this to see whether it made a difference. And lastly, among the Republicans running in the House, almost as high a number, 78% said nothing, 6% took a green position, and 16% took a not green position. So does this matter? Who's being smart here? So let's look at the relationship of these statements to victory rates. So we're going to begin here on the left with instances in which the Democrat was silent and the Republican was silent. Okay? Neither of them said anything. In those races, the Democrats won 17% of the time. Not very good. Now, when we move from here to here, the Republican remains silent, but the Democrat shifts from being silent to being green. Does it help to do so? Gigantically. 69% of these candidates won. Okay, now, imagine that you're the Republican, and you think actually being not green is a good thing. So I'm going to combat this 69 by going not green. So this is comparing instances in which the Democrats are all green. The Republican now shifts from saying nothing to taking a not green position. Does it drop this bar? It does not. So the Republican going not green didn't help. Now, what about here? What about the instance in which the Democrat is green and the Republican goes green? Now they're not different anymore. Is it possible that this nullifies the advantage that the Democrat enjoys by going green? The answer is it does. So that victory rate drops right back down to where it was before. If both candidates say nothing, the issue has the same impact as if the two candidates say the same thing. Voters say, well, I can't use this issue to make a decision, so I'll look somewhere else. Okay, now, what about this instance? What about the cases in which the Democrat is silent and the Republican goes not green? Is it possible that being not green without being challenged is actually a good thing? And as it turns out, it is. The victory rate for these candidates dropped from 18% to 4%. So that's the one instance in which going green is a good thing. But of course, this could be eliminated completely if the Democrat had gone green in this situation. Now, the last instance I'll show you, where the Democrat said nothing and the Republican went green, turns out no victories for the Democrat. So that's evidence that the Republican helped him or herself by going green when the Democrat was silent. Okay? Now, you know, of course, this is correlational evidence. There are all kinds of factors that could be confounded in this analysis. The people who chose to go green as compared to the people who chose not to say anything could have lots of other characteristics that are responsible instead for what I've shown you. So what we've done here is, and I apologize, I'm not going to walk you through this, high-tech statistical analysis where we're looking for what the candidates said as well as controlling for a variety of other variables that include whether the candidates were incumbents or not, And very importantly, the margin of victory that President Obama enjoyed in the state in 2008. So here we're looking at, is there a general leaning in the Republican or Democratic direction in those states? And it turns out the effects that you see up here, the asterisks that you see up here, show you the exact same effects I showed you earlier still hold when we control for those confounds. Now, nonetheless, I haven't shown you the strongest causal evidence that social scientists can produce. So it's a bit like tobacco companies saying, yes, but there's never been a true experiment done where you randomly assign people to either smoke cigarettes or not smoke cigarettes so we can see what the effect is. And that's a reasonable criticism. In this case, fortunately, we actually can do random assignments. So I'm going to show you what we did. This is an experiment embedded in a national survey with a representative sample of Americans, called by telephone on landlines and cell phones. All respondents in this survey listened to the interviewer read to them a description of a hypothetical candidate who we said was running for the Senate in their state. And they heard the candidate say things on either 2 or 3 policy issues, and then they were asked, how likely are you to vote for or against the candidate? The respondents were divided randomly into 3 equivalent groups. The first group, the control group, 1/3 of the respondents, heard the candidate make statements on terrorism and the economy. And after hearing each of these statements, they were asked, do you mostly agree or mostly disagree with what the candidate said? After they heard the quotes, the respondents were asked, now based on all the things you've heard the candidate say, would you definitely vote for the candidate, probably vote for the candidate, probably vote against, or definitely vote against? So you get the paradigm. This is a candidate who's silent on climate change. The second group heard exactly the same quotes on other issues and also heard the candidate express a green position. I'm actually just going to take a second to read this to you. This is what the candidate said. Like most Americans and most of the residents of our great state, I believe that global warming has been happening for the last 100 years, mainly because we've been burning fossil fuels and putting out greenhouse gases. Now is the time for us to stop this by ending our dependence on imported oil and coal to run our cars and heat our houses. We need to begin using new forms of energy that are made in America and will be renewable forever. We can build better cars that use less gasoline. We can build better appliances that use less electricity. And we can make power from the sun and from wind. We don't have to change our lifestyles, but we do need to reshape the way our country does business. We need to end our long-term addiction to polluting the environment and instead let American genius do what it does best. Transform our outdated ways of generating energy into new ones that create jobs and entire industries and stop the damage we've been doing to the environment. Now, this comes from 2 places, and you can certainly imagine writing this in many different ways. First, it comes from quotes from President Obama campaigning in 2008, and it comes from the surveys we've done, where what we did was and you can see the language right there. We took elements of those surveys and put them into this statement. The last group did not hear that green statement. They heard the candidate instead make a not green statement. And the language here is taken from Senate websites as well. Let me read this to you. There isn't any real science to say we are changing the climate of the Earth. The science on global warming is a hoax and is an attempt to perpetrate a fraud on the American people. Climate science is junk science, and global warming is a manufactured controversy. I don't buy into the whole man-made global warming, man-caused climate change mantra, and I believe that there's not sound science to back that up. We must spend no effort to deal with something that is not a problem at all. Yet that's exactly what's happening with the cap-and-trade bill that Congress has considered. I oppose the cap-and-trade bill. Cap-and-trade is a job killer and damages our economy. We should not invest in windmills and solar panels as alternative energy sources. Instead, we should continue to focus on our traditional sources of energy, coal, oil, and natural gas. We should expand energy production in our country, including by continuing to mine our coal and doing more drilling for oil here at home. Sound familiar? Okay. So the question then is, we have done an experiment. We have manipulated what this hypothetical candidate said. Each voter, each respondent hears only one version of the candidate who says nothing in the control group, the candidate who makes the green statement, or the candidate who makes the not green statement. What does this do to the rate at which people said they would vote for the candidate? Well, the control group actually kind of liked the candidate. 65% of them said they would vote for the candidate. When that candidate added a statement on the green side of the issue, that proportion rose to 77%, a statistically significant increase of about the magnitude that you would expect based on everything I've shown you so far. So you're not, I'm showing you the size of the issue public There's no reason to think this 65 is going to go to 99. It's a question of how much it increases at this smaller level. Now, what about going not green? Is going not green a good thing, a bad thing? Remember, there is no opposing candidate here to compete with. As it turns out, going not green is not a good thing. The proportion voting for the hypothetical candidate dropped from 65% to 48%. Significant decline. Now, you say, okay, fine, but what we really need to know is breaking these results out by Democrats, Republicans, and independents, because it's really the independents who matter. They're the people in play in every election. And if they're not being pushed around, I don't really care about the others. So let's break it down. First of all, for Democratic voters, 53% of them said they would vote for the candidate who was silent on climate change. 74% said they would vote for the candidate who took a green position. And 37% said they would vote for the candidate who took a not green position. So again, you see the same basic pattern. Now let's look at Republican voters. The Republicans actually love the silent candidate, saying nothing. They liked what the candidate said on the economy and terrorism, other such issues. 83% of them said they would vote for that candidate. When adding a green statement to it, there was a small drop to 78% taking a green position. And actually taking a not green position caused even more of a drop, this being significantly lower than this. So even among Republicans, taking a not green position hurts a little bit. But the real story here is no big impact. So now, what about the people we care most about, the independents? 63% of them liked the control candidate who said nothing. Here's the drum roll. 79%, an increase of 16 percentage points due to going green, and a decline of 19 percentage points down to 44% by going not green. In general, independents on this issue are about as green as the Democrats are. And so those people in play prefer. Now, I'm going to also do one last analysis with these data, which is to break up the sample into the issue public members who we think ought to be paying attention and the non-members. And if you look only at the people who care about this issue, 60% of them liked the silent candidate, 78% liked the green candidate, and 38% liked the not green candidate. So this is what we expect to see, this pattern of sensitivity in that group. And so the differences here, this is an 18 percentage point increase and a 22 percentage point decrease. When you look at the non-members, you can see these numbers are smaller. They still show an increase and a decrease, but the differences are only 9 percentage points and 4 percentage points. So it is, in fact, the people who care deeply about the issue who are responding to the information on it. Now, I won't walk you through this, but we've done exactly the same experiment with the silent and green candidates in 3 separate states, Florida, Maine, and Massachusetts, and we found exactly the same results. Okay, we're almost done. The last little bit. This is the 2008 U.S. presidential election. And here, what I'm going to do is use a statistical methodology that is absolutely mainstream in political science. It is the standard approach to understanding the determinants of vote choice. To think about this election, though, let me just tell you something about the background. Now, you can think back to 2008, and perhaps you remember that Barack Obama and John McCain were very similar. They both said climate change was real. They both endorsed cap and trade. And in particular, if you look at John McCain's website, he had an issues tab, and on the issues tab was a link here talking about climate change right here. And if you went to that link, he had lots of text, and the centerpiece of his policy was endorsing cap and trade. On Barack Obama's 2008 website, there was an issues link. When you look here, he had energy and the environment. He had a lot to say. And an important centerpiece of this was cap and trade as well. So in some ways, the candidates might have looked very, very similar. But before you reach that conclusion, let me show you what they said about climate change when they were asked during the October 7, 2008 debate. They were asked by the questioner, I want to know what you would do within the first 2 years to make sure that Congress moves fast as far as environmental issues like climate change and green jobs. Here's John McCain's answer. Look, we're in tough economic times. We all know that. And let's never forget the struggle that Americans are in today. And when we have an issue that we may hand our children and our grandchildren, a damaged planet, I've disagreed strongly with the Bush administration on this issue. I traveled all over the world looking at the effects of greenhouse gas emissions, Joe Lieberman and I introduced the first legislation, and we forced votes on it. That's the good news, my friends. The bad news is we lost. But we kept the debate going, and we kept this issue to posing to Americans the danger that climate change opposes. So we tried and we lost. Not the most compelling statement. Barack Obama's statement instead. And it is absolutely critical that we understand this is not just a challenge, it's an opportunity. Because if we create a new energy economy, we can create 5 million new jobs easily here in the United States. And we can do it, but we're going to have to make an investment. The same way the computer was originally invented by a bunch of government scientists who were trying to figure out for defense purposes how to communicate, we've got to understand that this is a national security issue as well. And that's why we've got to make some investments, and I've called for investments in solar, wind, and geothermal. It's easy to talk about this stuff during a campaign, but it's important for us to understand that it requires a sustained effort from the next president. Sounds a bit like the Green candidate in our hypothetical experiment, right? So I want to suggest to you that they actually are different in what they said, and that the issue public would be aware of this and to see a basis for choice. So the test we're going to do comes from a data set that we call the Face-to-Face Recruited Internet Survey Platform, affectionately the FRISP. This involved randomly selecting 1,000 households across the country, knocking on the door and saying, "Hi, we're here from Stanford University, funded by the National Science Foundation, to give you a free laptop computer and free high-speed internet access in your home that we will pay to install and pay for a year. If you will agree to do 30 minutes of survey question answering for us each month for a year, we'll pay you some cash every month after you finish the questionnaire, and we will let you keep the laptop at the end of the year if you'd like it." So it turns out to work pretty well. By the end of the year, we had 92% of the folks still completing surveys, and some of the folks who were not completing the surveys were no longer alive, so we can't blame them. So here's a question that was asked in one of these surveys running up to the 2008 election. Next, we'd like to ask whether you favor, oppose, or neither favor nor oppose a series of ways the federal government might try to reduce future global warming. Power plants put gases into the air that could cause global warming. Do you favor, oppose, or neither favor nor oppose the federal government lowering the amount of these gases that power plants are allowed to put out in the air? And then we asked how much do they favor it. And we also asked people, what do you think Barack Obama's position is on this issue? And what do you think John McCain's position is on this issue? And we determined by interviewing them after the election, did they vote for Obama? Did they vote for McCain? Did they vote for someone else? Or did they not vote at all? So we did complex statistical analysis controlling for lots of those other ingredients of vote choice that I told you about before, including their ideologies, their party affiliations, their approval of George W. Bush's performance, their judgments of the health of the economy, their interest in politics, demographics, and other factors. So the technique is called multinomial logistic regression. We also did a similar analysis with Probit to make sure we get the same results. And I'll tell you there's a bit of debate among political scientists about whether the computation should be done using Euclidean distance, city block distance, or directional correspondence. We did it all 3 ways and found the same result, which is here. Okay. So lucky for you, you don't have to look at the fact that voting for Barack Obama was statistically significantly less likely among conservatives, more likely among Democrats, less likely among Republicans, more likely among people who disapproved of George Bush's performance, more likely among people who perceived the economy to be doing badly, and so on. All of the expected predictors had the effects we'd expect. The place you need to look is this little tiny number right here, and right here, and right here. Regardless of whether we used this method or this method or this method, proximity to Barack Obama on the issue of climate change, on the issue of restricting emissions, enhanced voting for Mr. Obama and reduced voting for John McCain, controlling for all of these other factors. So, the next question is, was that effect concentrated among the issue public members? And the answer is it is. That regression coefficient is highly significant among the people who said they care deeply about the issue, and not at all statistically significant among the people who did not care about the issue. So what I've shown you is results from 3 different methods. First, we looked at candidates' websites and the relationship to their actual victory rates. Secondly, I showed you a hypothetical election embedded in a national survey. And lastly, we looked at real voting in the 2008 presidential race. And our conclusions are, from all this work, one, America does remain largely green on this issue, by many standards, hugely green. Taking green positions helped candidates in 2008 and 2010. Taking not green positions hurt the candidates. And the impact was concentrated among that small group of people who wake up each morning paying a great deal of attention to what happens on this issue. So, in conclusion, let me say first, I hope you've gotten a sense, perhaps a bit more than you did an hour ago, about how Americans are thinking about this issue and how they use this issue to make vote decisions. Secondly, I hope you have a sense, maybe a bit more about how social science in this arena operates. How, with the appropriate opportunities, we can peer into the minds of voters using multiple methodologies, each of which has its own limitations, and eventually produce a set of results that reassure us about the validity of our conclusions. We use a combination of experimental methods, statistical techniques, high-quality survey data collection in collaboration with important partners, and this is the kind of result that we can produce. We hope that it adds positively to the public debate. And finally, let me thank you for your time and your interest and your openness to these data, and I'm happy to take questions. Thank you.
Folks, anybody would like to ask questions, you can queue up behind the mics here, and you can ask those questions as people step up.
And I'll go in first. Hi, John. That was great. Thank you so much for coming. Alan Krupnick from Resources for the Future. So I was actually surprised at what looked like a low degree of greenness relatively in Europe. Because we did a study with the University of Gothenburg where we looked at climate skepticism as well in the U.S., Sweden, and China. And the U.S. had about your 25% climate skeptics, like we got. But in Sweden, it was about 5% skeptics. And in China, it was about the same, maybe 7 to 8% skeptics. So is it that question that's the problem, or our survey, or what do you think?
But you're pointing your finger at a really important factor, which is we know in this domain, question wording matters a lot. And I could show you a slide, I'm sorry I don't have it available, that arrays a variety of about 15 questions that have been asked by different survey organizations in the U.S. that have been looked at one time or another as indicating what percent of Americans are on the green side of this issue. The highest number, the largest percentage, came from a Gallup survey at about 92%, and the lowest number at about 47% also came from a Gallup survey with a differently worded question. And so there's a tremendous variation depending upon question wording. And so, certainly this is a question, when I look at it, it's a question about seriousness, right? It's not asking, is it happening? And it's also, notice, it's seriousness at the moment. And so you can easily imagine that people would say, well, right now, here's what's going on, but in 100 years, it's going to be a lot more serious. So I wouldn't be skeptical about your result, because I suspect you're measuring skepticism differently, and that many of the folks who gave lower than 7 to 10 ratings here nonetheless believe it exists.
My name is James Handley, and I'm with the Carbon Tax Center. And I noticed in your statement, your hypothetical statement for Senate candidates, the green statement, it talked about agreeing with and supporting climate science, and then it went into supporting cap and trade. And I have a hypothesis which I would like you to kind of comment on, which is I think there are some skeptics, or at least apparent skeptics, of climate science that are really skeptics of climate policy, who are opposed to regulation and who find that cap and trade is unpalatable for various reasons, but who might be supportive of other policies. Have you looked at that? And for example, of course, I'm interested in people who might be less skeptical of climate science if there were a choice like a carbon tax, particularly with revenue return.
Yeah, okay, a few answers. First, you have plenty of company. Many people who I talk to have expressed this point of view, that if you don't like the policy proposals on the table, it would help you feel more comfortable to say, and furthermore, I don't even think this is a problem. So it's a kind of dissonance-reducing rationalization that is the proposal here. So, and people who I respect a great deal have proposed this, in addition to you, who I respect as well. Our data have not shown evidence to support it. In particular, we have seen the proportion of people expressing...
Have you ever separated those 2 points?
Yeah, so I'll just explain it. So what we've seen is ups and downs, those slight ups and downs, in the proportion of people who express a belief in climate change, but no change over time in support for policies. The policies have been sitting quite flat. So you could imagine that if these two are really just rationalizations for each other, that they would move together, but they don't. Nonetheless, your hypothesis could be true, because if the fact is that support for these policies, I mean, for example, cap and trade is about 70%, allowing the EPA to continue limiting greenhouse gas emissions is at above 80%. These numbers are very big. Americans don't hesitate on this issue, including large numbers of Republicans who are skeptical about government regulation in general, not in this environmental domain nearly as much. So, having said that, if we could somehow provoke an up or down in those policy opinions, we could see whether the rationalization you're talking about happens. And the more people ask me this question, the more likely I am to do that study. So maybe we'll do it.
Thank you.
My name is Scott Bush. I've been dealing with this issue for almost 25 years now. I have one question and one comment. The question is, I think your data would have been much more interesting if it reflected on those part in the Congress where it's not a safe seat, that is between 25, within 10%, or it would be very interesting if you showed what the interest was in the swing states or just the states that lost.
Great. I'm so glad you asked that question. We'll come back to your comment in a second.
But wait a minute, no, it relates to something else.
Okay.
Which is, I would simply say on this, is that in 2008, we had a bunch of people that were repealed and a president didn't do it, who got us into this mess. And in 2010, same thing, because we had a president who isn't doing a damn thing to get us out of the mess.
Yeah, so let me, so I think...
You could take it to any of your 20 variables and come out the same thing, but it really doesn't make much difference because there's an overpowering impact that the public thinks why they like a candidate or why they don't like a candidate.
Okay, the ending of your question, I'm not sure. Let me separate that.
They're just PO'd, okay?
Yeah, it's okay. So let me thank you for your first question, because it's an opportunity for me to tell you something I should have mentioned earlier. Remember, I showed you in this graph, I showed you, that's right, we won't do it, that what the candidates said appeared to make a big difference in their victory rates. But I also showed you that relatively small percentages of people are being moved on one side or the other of the issue. The only way that can be true is if the green and not green statements made during the 2010 congressional elections were happening in close races. And in fact, that's exactly what happened. So I apologize for not showing you the result, but what I can tell you is if I had showed you the results only in the races with a very small margin of victory, the exact same thing happens. And those are the cases in which these flips occur. So that's the first thing. Your second conclusion, your conclusion was, Americans are PO'd and they don't care about this issue and they're not voting on this issue. I guess I've shown you 3 studies.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, that our results suggest the opposite.
Interesting. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm Christopher Krause from the National Environmental Education Foundation. I actually came up here to discuss the issue that the gentleman here brought up in terms of, I noticed that on John McCain's website, he talks about American energy and climate change. Barack Obama, however, connects those issues directly and has the energy and the environment tab. So I thought that was an interesting contrast, and I'm not sure if that made any difference or if you've analyzed that. The other thing I wanted to mention was I was shocked about Wyoming. It was 88%. This is a state that has a heavy fossil fuel industry, and yet 88% of the population, I believe, supported government specifically limiting emissions on fossil fuel emissions. And on the other hand, another western state, Oregon, where I'm from, was actually one of the more skeptical states, or states that was more
Let's call it less green, because there
less
aren't
green,
any,
yeah,
not really
right.
any skeptical.
Less green, even though there's no fossil fuel industry there, and almost the vast majority of the power is from hydropower, which is emissions free. If anything, if there was a cap and trade, states like Oregon would benefit much more. you have any comments on the factors that may have gone into that sort of those sort of levels of support?
Yeah, so I'm delighted you're shocked by it. That means there's some value in these data, not what everybody would have guessed. And you're reading it exactly right, that it really is not about impact on the local economy. And if one of the, I think, most compelling ways to think about it is that if you look at the percent of a state's GDP that's attributable to these industries, or the percent of the workforce in the state employed in these industries, they're tiny numbers. They don't get up to 40 or 50 or 60 or 70%. They're tiny. So the idea that states would think that locally, it doesn't seem plausible after the fact once you look at these numbers. So the question you're asking, which I think is an important one, is why is there this variation? What is going on? And we plan to look at this. The challenge for us is that in order to look at it, we need bigger budgets, we need more state-based surveys, and we need to be able to explore what produces those geographic differences. Now, you saw that there is no general pattern of hotter means greener or cooler means greener. So we are confronting that challenge. The key ingredients we've seen so far that play into this decision involve trust in scientists and perceptions of the nature of world temperature changes. So you can think about the public as divided into two groups. About 70% who trust natural scientists studying this phenomena. They listen to them. What they hear them say, they accept. The 30% of Americans who are more skeptical about science don't trust those scientists. They appear to base their decision about climate change, importantly, on what has happened to average world temperatures recently. So right after 2008, which was an unusually cool year, that group became a little more skeptical. Right after 2010, which, as you know, was a record high year temperature-wise worldwide, those people moved back up again. So that dynamic is an important part of this, but it's certainly not the whole story. The most powerful variable that we have seen to explain differences between people in this domain is the nature of their news media exposure. You can divide the media in two groups, Fox and not Fox. And we did the following analysis. We asked our respondents in the last 30 days, how many days have you watched news on Fox television and how many days have you watched news on another network, not Fox? So we've got from 0 to 30 days of Fox exposure and from 0 to 30 days of not Fox exposure. If I had my computer, I would show you a graph which shows you remarkably linear trends. The more days of Fox watching, the more skeptical the individual is about climate. The more days of not Fox watching, the more green they are on climate. So one argument you can make is, Fox News is misleading people if you believe that. But another argument you can make is, Americans aren't watching the news enough. If only they watched the other news networks more, they would be even more on the green side, that the dissemination of the science comes through that method. So depending on, you can take a number of different positions in looking at this. Now you might say, well, isn't this just selection? Don't the skeptical people enjoy watching Fox, so they choose to do so, and the not skeptical people choose CNN or something else? We've actually done a sophisticated statistical analysis to pick apart selection from influence, and the influence effects are there. So it does look like, so far, the most powerful determinant is exposure to the information flow. If you get exposure to the mainstream flow versus if you get exposure to a skeptical flow.
And what was the distribution curve on the Fox News watching? Is it like some people watch Fox all the time and some people, don't watch Fox at all, or is it?
Yeah, it's a great question. I wish Bo McInnes were here. She could answer that question, but we can tell you later.
Hi, Nick Sunt with the World Wildlife Fund. Your policy analysis and the questions that you've been asking have pretty much focused exclusively on mitigation issues. Have you considered also including preparedness or adaptation questions? And if you did, how might your results be different?
Yeah, you're asking a great question. You also have good company, including my colleague Buzz Thompson at Stanford and others at Stanford who say to me, the mitigation is yesterday, adaptation is today and tomorrow. This is the future. So we have moved in that direction of looking at adaptation to some degree. In fact, we did it in a collaborative study with Resources for the Future a few years ago. And people are supportive of mitigation still today in huge numbers, as they are of adaptation. We have seen more support for mitigation than adaptation, so it's not clear that people have yet accepted the inevitability of the problem.
Okay,
We
thanks.
don't know what adaptation means. We did some research on that separately.
Hi, Megan Tai with Union of Concerned Scientists. I'm wondering if you ever incorporate questions that deal with costs, both the willingness to pay for government policy on climate change or whether people think it will be inexpensive or expensive to reduce emissions.
Thank you so much. Okay, so that's a great lead into the following. Underlying your question is wisdom that you may not even know about based on a large literature in social science that suggests the following. That on many issues over the years, Americans have manifested what's called a principle implementation gap, where they say in principle, they love the idea of doing something. But as soon as you start getting specific about how to do it, they don't like this policy, they don't like that policy, they don't like the other one. And especially when you start telling them how much it's going to cost. Wait a minute. I was willing to support it if it's free, but I'm not willing to do it if it's going to cost me anything. So we've actually explored exactly that issue. We've done it in two ways. In a collaboration with New Scientist magazine, we did an experiment where we described in great detail, with the help of Resources for the Future experts, a series of policies to our survey respondents and told them how much it would cost them to reduce emissions by particular amounts. Different respondents were randomly assigned to different prices. And what we saw was the higher the price went, the less people liked it. But that nonetheless, so that's a good thing, right? That means that they're responding sensitively to price as you would expect that they would. But you could, even with conventional pricing, the RFF's best estimate of what it would really cost to accomplish these things, there was healthy majority support for government mandates in this arena. I'll pay this money if you guarantee me reductions in emissions. Now, cap and trade, of course, has a mandate built in as well as the trading, but simply mandates without were acceptable at the price it would cost. We've repeated similar experiments in later surveys where we described to people an 85% reduction in emissions by the year 2050. Different people were told different prices. And when respondents were told the price that the CBO, the Congressional Budget Office, says it would cost, about $146 per American household per year, that a majority of Americans in our most recent test of this said that they would vote for that policy. And a substantial minority were willing to vote for that policy even at $200 or $250. So the idea of raising that amount of money from the American public through taxation doesn't seem hard. So your question is great, and fortunately we have collected some data, and it looks like price doesn't stand in the way.
Shall we take you two more questions?
Okay.
I'm Gunther Hörmandinger from the EU delegation. I'm the Environment Councillor. So here's a European view. The first is a sigh of relief looking at those numbers. The second, maybe in response to the remark about Sweden, when you saw those distributions among states, quoting Swedish figures is a bit like going to, Vermont maybe. Sweden is well known to be one of the greenest EU member states. If you do EU-wide surveys, you get different numbers. And the third, and that's the question, this is all a domestic debate. Have you got any information about what American attitudes are towards international action? Cancun or whatever.
Yep. So one question we've been asking for a long time is, do you think the United States should take action to reduce its emissions even if other large emitting countries like China and India fail to do so? Or do you think the U.S. should only take action if those other countries do so? Huge majorities say we should act even if other countries don't take that action. And that's been consistent when we've asked that question over the years. Beyond that, we have not gone into great detail about what other countries should do, but we could.
Hi, I'm David Hunter from AIDA, and I have both a question and a comment. I'll start with a comment. The question that you put up to your respondents on the negative side about the candidate who does not support global warming does not look very much like the sort of statements that we've encountered, and we've put a lot of effort into since we support cap and trade, trying to fight back against those who are opposed to it. And I would suggest that our job would have been a lot easier if people had put up the sort of statement that you had put up. But in fact, what they're doing is there are some who are saying something sort of similar to what you're doing, but the majority of them are saying more things like, this is a job-killing energy tax. There's too much government regulation. This is another example of over-government regulation. Do you want to have to pay more energy taxes? Do you want to have to pay more costs? And it's a lot of those messages we found are quite difficult to fight back against. And another difference is probably that in your survey, you have 2 questions, equal amount of time for each. And in general, we did not find that we were able to get the message out sort of in where we were getting equal amount of coverage on our side as the other side was getting. So conventional wisdom among politicians who actually, either won races or lost races in the last election, I think was a bit different in a number of cases from your poll results. And that might have been because, for both of those reasons, both because, the amount of time that one side versus the other, one side basically was not defending global warming because they had moved on to other things and didn't realize that they needed to defend it. The other side was attacking it. It was not a fair balance of time or media. And the other is they were presenting the arguments in a very different way about taxes and regulation. The one other thing I wanted to say is AIDA is actually putting on a symposium on climate change and business risk next week. And one of the things we're looking at, and we're not statisticians, but we're trying to figure out if there's a difference between how businesses, how industry looks at climate versus the politicians and the public. And I guess from a number of, not statistical analysis, but things such as most companies factoring a carbon price into their inherent assumptions going forward about where they put investments suggest that there is a difference in opinion, but I'm wondering if you have seen anything that might be a bit more statistically rigorous along those lines.
Yeah, I haven't seen anything statistically rigorous. I have anecdotes I can tell you of companies, including ones represented here today, that are thinking exactly the way you're speaking. But I have seen surveys, including one released last week, that claim to be a survey of businesses. But it won't surprise you to know I'm kind of rigorous. If you want to call it a survey, I've got to know who is the population, how was the random sample drawn, and so on. And that hasn't been done in ways I've yet seen for businesses. So I'm hesitant to reach any conclusions about beliefs among businesses. But to go back to your earlier comment, you're absolutely right in a series of ways. First of all, our statement, the skeptical statement on climate, came very importantly from one particular senator's website. So it's real. The elements of it are there. But it's an unusual one. You're absolutely right. And so we could do this experiment again with more mild versions of it. Even something as simple as, I think the world's heating up. I just don't know who's causing it. And I certainly don't think we should try to do anything to change what Mother Nature is doing. So, the series of more gentle messages. There's also the job killer message and the tax message that you proposed. We have actually asked questions in our surveys about, do you think taking action to address climate change will hurt the number of jobs in your state and in the country, will help increase the number of jobs in your state and the country, or have no impact? And when we ask that separately about the U.S. or the state the respondent lives in, the majority of people always say it will help, not hurt. So the skeptical message on that point from mainly Republican candidates has not grabbed hold of more than 10, 11, 12, 15% of Americans. So that's not I wouldn't expect that to be a powerful convincer. The tax message, on the other hand, the only domain in which we have seen a majority of Americans opposed to any policy for reducing emissions we asked about is this. Do you think the federal government should increase taxes on gasoline to cause people to buy less of it? So people say, okay, so the government is going to take more money from me. I don't know what they're going to do with this money. And the whole purpose is just to manipulate my behavior? No, I do not like that. So that message does have the potential if there is a focus on taxation. But honestly, my take on this is that candidates are really not in a position to persuade Americans to change their minds on this stuff. That from the work that we've done, it's not easy to move people. People have their opinions. They're staying pretty stable over time. There have been many attempts. The Gore movie, many people view as an important moment for the green side of the issue. It produced no real noticeable change at all in the distribution of opinions of Americans on this issue. So I think the key essence of what's correct about your observation is what I showed you in these data. That is, in the 2010 races, the majority of Democrats, or not the majority, but a substantial number of Democrats said nothing on this issue. And those were missed opportunities for them if they endorse these views. So that would be the direction they should take if they want to win more.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.